South Africa stands as the world's second largest citrus exporter, and 2026 is poised to be a year for the history books with a record-breaking 3.05 million metric ton harvest. But behind this massive citrus boom lies a hidden vulnerability. Just as the April harvest begins, a perfect storm of global conflict and sudden diesel shortages is threatening to bring the entire supply chain to a screeching halt. With 140,000 jobs at risk and 95% of the crop dependent on a single fragile lifeline, is South Africa's golden season about to turn sour? Let's explore the Achilles heel of the 2026 citrus boom.
South Africa's citrus industry is gearing up for what should be a massive, record-breaking season. It's fantastic news. But there's a shadow hanging over this golden harvest. A single, critical weakness that could bring the whole thing to a grinding halt. And it's not what you think. It's not the weather, it's not pests, it's the incredibly fragile supply chain that gets all that amazing fruit from the groves to the rest of the world. So, just look at this. On the left, you've got these beautiful, sun-drenched citrus groves. Just incredible. And on the right, a simple diesel pump. Believe it or not, that pump is the absolute linchpin for this entire industry. You see, the whole journey from that farm to your fruit bowl, it's completely powered by what goes into the tank of that truck. Okay, so before we dive into the risks, let's just take a moment to understand exactly what's at stake here. This isn't just about oranges and lemons. We're talking about a genuine cornerstone of the South African economy. And to put that into perspective, South Africa is, and this is no exaggeration, a citrus superpower. It's the second largest exporter on the entire planet. The only country ahead of them is Spain. That is a huge, huge deal. And this industry is not just big, it's getting bigger fast. The upcoming 2026 season is projected to absolutely smash records. We're talking over 3 million metric tons of fruit. That's a 22% jump in just 1 year. That kind of growth is explosive. But, as we're about to see, so is the risk that comes with it.
And, behind all these massive numbers are people. 140,000 jobs just at the farm level depend on this harvest going smoothly. That's 140,000 families whose entire livelihoods are riding on this.
But here's the problem. There's a storm brewing, thousands of miles away. A distant conflict is sending out these shockwaves that are landing right at the fuel pumps in South Africa, and it's happening right on the eve of this record-breaking harvest.
So take a look at this. This diagram really lays out the whole chain reaction. It all kicks off at the global level, right? Conflict in the Middle East. But just watch how that instability cascades all the way down and creates a very real, very local crisis. Let's break down how that happens. Okay, so step 1, that conflict halfway across the world creates systemic disruption. It completely rattles global energy markets and it throws international shipping routes into chaos. Suddenly, the nice, predictable flow of energy and goods, well, it's not so predictable anymore. So what happens next? Well, all that chaos translates directly into economic pressure right back in South Africa. The markets get jittery, and the country starts bracing for some seriously steep fuel price hikes. And that puts a massive strain on an industry that, as we've said, runs entirely on diesel.
And this brings us to the final and maybe the most crucial step: people's behavior changes. When everyone's afraid of shortages and price spikes, they start buying fuel differently. Some might call it panic buying. At the same time, suppliers start controlling who gets what. And that is what creates the spotty, on-the-ground diesel shortages that farmers are reporting right now.
And this is where it gets really tricky, because you have this dangerous disconnect. Officially, the government is saying, hey, no problem, our national fuel supply is stable. But on the ground, you have the transport operators and the Citrus Growers Association sounding the alarm, saying, whoa, we're seeing limited fuel, controlled selling, this is a direct threat to our entire supply chain. So you have to ask, how can this global ripple create such a specific local threat? Why is a temporary diesel shortage an existential crisis for such a massive industry? Well, it all comes down to one single number. This diagram just shows it perfectly. On one end, you have this huge output from the farms and the packhouses. On the other, you have the entire global market waiting. But the connection between them? It's this tiny, squeezed bottleneck. That bottleneck is the fact that 95% of all that fruit moves by road. It's a massive vulnerability.
And look, don't just take my word for it. The CEO of the Citrus Growers Association, Dr. Boishiko Nashabele, puts it perfectly. This over-reliance on trucks is the core of the problem. When 95% of your entire operation depends on trucks, any little disruption to the fuel for those trucks becomes a 5-alarm fire.
Okay, so the problem is crystal clear. But the industry isn't just sitting back and waiting for disaster. There's a two-pronged strategy being pushed hard right now to navigate this crisis. One for the short term and one for the long haul.
So in the short term, the call is for some tactical relief, basically a temporary break on the fuel levy for farmers to help absorb these immediate price shocks. But the real solution, the big picture fix, is a total structural overhaul, getting away from the dependency on trucks and aggressively moving towards the national freight rail system. They're calling it the rail imperative, and it's really about fundamentally re-engineering the supply chain. The whole idea is to take those enormous volumes of crops off the very vulnerable road network and put them onto the much more resilient and efficient rail system.
But, and there's always a but, right? There's a catch. Time. Progress is being made on getting the private sector more involved in rail, but the Citrus Growers Association is being very clear it's just not happening fast enough. The scale and the pace have to ramp up, and they have to ramp up dramatically.
And you know, fuel isn't the only vulnerability here. This map shows another one. A whopping 19% of all citrus shipments are going directly to the Middle East, the very same reason that's causing all the fuel instability in the first place. So the solution here is to expand the buffer, to gain better market access to more stable places like the US, China, India, and the EU.
So when you look at all this, it becomes really obvious that securing the future of this vital industry isn't just one group's responsibility. It's going to take a massive, coordinated effort from every single person and organization involved.
Think of it like a puzzle. The government needs to step up with policy changes and levy relief. The fuel suppliers have to make sure allocation is transparent. The logistics operators need to have rock-solid backup plans, and the growers and exporters themselves have to keep pushing for new markets. Every single piece of this puzzle has to fit perfectly.
Because at the end of the day, this is about so much more than just one harvest. This is about protecting a core pillar of the South African economy, and of course, those 140,000 jobs that rely on it.
Which really leaves us with one final urgent question. The clock is ticking, the harvest is coming, and the stakes honestly couldn't be any higher. With everything on the line, can all of these essential pieces actually come together in time? The answer to that question is going to decide the fate of South Africa's golden harvest.
Welcome to the debate. Right now, we have about 3 million tons of South African citrus just, ripening on the trees.
Oh, wow. That is a massive harvest.
Right, and it's gearing up for the huge April export season. But there's a major catch. A geopolitical conflict thousands of miles away in the Middle East might actually cause that fruit to rot before it ever reaches a ship.
Yeah, we are essentially staring down a massive supply chain crisis here.
Exactly. Diesel supply risks and fuel price shocks are actively threatening the world's second largest citrus exporter. So our central question today is, when you are facing an immediate energy security threat, should an industry prioritize urgent government policy interventions or focus entirely on resolving its underlying structural vulnerabilities? I'm taking the stance that we need immediate government policy relief just to protect the current supply chain.
Well, and I will argue that those short-term subsidies are actually a trap. I mean, they completely distract from the critical, long overdue need to overhaul port logistics and, shift away from this near total reliance on road transport.
Okay, let's ground this in physical reality for a second. Citrus is highly perishable. Once it is picked, a ticking clock basically starts. You absolutely have to maintain a strict cold chain all the way to the port.
Right, because if the temperature spikes, you lose everything.
Exactly. So if trucks are parked because diesel is either unavailable or just prohibitively expensive, that cold chain breaks. The product is destroyed. And that puts like 140,000 farm-level jobs at immediate risk.
Which is devastating, yes.
It is. And that's why industry heavyweights, like the Citrus Growers Association of Southern Africa, plus agricultural chambers like AgBiz and AgriSA, they are calling for an integrated national approach. Specifically, they want a temporary fuel levy exemption for primary producers. Without that intervention, the trucks simply can't afford to run.
Okay, but granting those fuel levy exemptions totally ignores the fatal flaw of this entire system, which is a 95% dependency on road transport.
Yeah, it's high.
It is incredibly high. We are moving millions of tons of heavy freight on trucks instead of trains. And furthermore, official reports from the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources actually show that national fuel supplies are stable.
Wait, stable?
Yeah, the isolated fuel shortages we are seeing aren't a national deficit at all. They are literally just symptoms of unusual buying patterns and controlled allocation. So by constantly relying on government exemptions, the industry avoids doing the really hard, vital work of accelerating private sector freight rail expansion.
I hear that, but look at the catalyst here. The Middle East conflict forces shipping lines to reroute, right? Which drives up global freight and crude oil costs. That geopolitical friction lands right on the South African trucker's lap exactly as the harvest peaks.
Sure, the timing is terrible.
So a fuel levy exemption acts like a shock absorber for the supply chain. It doesn't fix the pothole, which, as you noted, is our lack of rail, but it stops the chassis from snapping when we hit it.
I see the analogy, but
We have to mitigate the shock to retain our major export markets, particularly in the Middle East, which accounts for 19% of our shipments. If we miss this April window, buyers aren't going to wait. They will simply get their citrus from Spain.
Right, but that shock absorber is exactly the problem here. It is the classic paradox of subsidies. When you shield an industry from the pain of a crisis, you actually make its underlying infrastructure way more fragile over time.
How so, though?
Well, if the government continuously steps in to artificially lower the cost of trucking via levy exemptions, where is the economic pressure to transition to rail? I mean, shielding them removes the financial imperative to evolve. True long-term stability requires feeling the friction of these logistics disruptions to force a much faster, larger-scale transition away from trucks.
Okay, but the friction you're talking about isn't just an abstract economic theory. It represents actual rural livelihoods.
I know, and I'm not discounting that.
The Citrus Growers Association absolutely knows the current road system is fragile. They are actively welcoming private sector involvement in rail. But you can't build a national rail network by April.
Well, no, of course not.
The fruit is literally on the trees right now. We have to survive this season just to fund the next decade's infrastructure.
But see, the fruit is on the trees now rationale is used every single season to delay structural reform. Every year is treated as an unprecedented emergency. As long as the government bails out the road transport costs, logistics operators are never going to actually fund and build the rail infrastructure at the scale required.
So you're saying
Enduring the immediate pain is literally the only mechanism that forces capital to move from subsidizing trucks to actually building trains.
that 95% reliance on road transport really is exactly why these short-term shocks are so devastating. It forces us to ask this core question: do we buy time by enacting immediate policy relief to ensure short-term survival? Or do we force the fix by enduring logistical pain to compel those structural improvements?
Yeah, and we both clearly agree that relying almost entirely on trucks is a massive, unsustainable liability, especially when geopolitical instability thousands of miles away can ripple down and completely paralyze local supply chains.
Absolutely. Maintaining global competitiveness in this kind of volatile environment is incredibly complex.
It really is.
There is plenty more to explore in the source material regarding these logistics frameworks and energy security strategies. Thank you for joining us as we explored these perspectives, leaving you to consider the best path forward.